Can you guys hear me? All right. I'm Todd Johnson. I work with the University of Wisconsin in River Falls, but I'm actually 100% paid for by UW Extension. So I'm technically a River Falls employee, but I actually am an Extension state specialist for land use and community development. So I just started this gig in January. Prior to that, I worked for 4 years as a county-based educator down in Grant County, Wisconsin. If you know where Grant County, Wisconsin, raise your hand. Okay. All right, good. Prior to that, I worked 4 years at the Regional Planning Commission out of Platteville in southwestern Wisconsin, and my duties there were primarily developing comprehensive plans, about 36 of them, and a county-wide plan as well, and some other activities. So when asked to present about comprehensive planning, I first felt this real sinking sensation in my gut because I've done quite a bit of that, and it can be very exhausting, and it can be really useful as well, hopefully. But I'm here to tell you a little bit about it, talk a little bit about updating comprehensive plans, and really I'm more interested in what your experiences are, if you have any. So of the folks who are here, how many of you come from a jurisdiction that has a comprehensive plan right now? Fantastic. Okay. Those of you that had raised your hands, did you actually work on developing those plans? Somewhat? No, somewhat, a little bit. Okay. So there's no rule saying you have to hire a consultant. There's no rule you have to go through an RPC. There's no rule you have to go through anybody. You can do it yourself. But sometimes it can be very helpful. We'll get into that. We'll get into that, I promise. Yeah. How many people enjoyed developing their comprehensive plan? Raise your hand. All right, excellent. Excellent. We're going to talk a little bit about that maybe throughout the course of this, or if we have some time, because the thing that I experienced while helping 36 jurisdictions develop their comprehensive plans was a lot of anxiety because they felt like this was being forced upon them, and a lot of frustration because they didn't understand exactly what they were doing and why they were doing it. And so I spent a lot of my time working with small towns and communities, helping them understand the value of doing this in the first place, and maybe why they should take this seriously and enjoy it at the same time, because you really are given an opportunity to kind of write the story of your community and what you want it to be. So with that, I'm going to kind of move forward a little bit here. The things I'm going to talk about tonight, and I have a lot of slides, and we don't have to spend a lot of time on any individual slide. We'll move this along. But we'll first talk a little bit about purpose and benefits of planning just in general, what the comprehensive planning requirements are in the state of Wisconsin, how you might update your comprehensive plan, and implementation, which is really where the rubber hits the road. So probably many of you who have done this before understand that a comprehensive plan is a local government's guide to communities' physical, social, and economic development. Okay, it's a guide. It's not necessarily a regulation, it's a guide. It's about past, present, and future trends. It's looking at your long-range vision of your community, your setting aspirational goals and how you're going to get there. And look, this illustration shows at the bottom, it's really about where are we now, where are we going, where do we want to be, and how are we going to get there. Now, there's a lot of gobbledygook that's put into the statute, but for the most part, any planning activity is really about these four elements. Does that make sense? It doesn't have to be any more complicated than that. So it's a proactive approach to the future. One of the main reasons why we have comprehensive smart growth law in the state of Wisconsin is because we didn't have a proactive approach to land use decisions. It fosters predictable and defensible decisions. It's for making informed decisions that will balance the need of the community. It allows the community to identify, anticipate, and balance and decide how to meet its needs in the areas of protecting resources and character, targeted economic development and public investments, cost-effective delivery of services. Everybody likes that, right? Intergovernmental cooperation and communication, and balance of community interests and private rights. This is a long way of saying it makes things politically correct and defensible in court. Okay? So, if you don't want to plan, here are some of the consequences you have to be aware of. Inconsistent decisions. You get a mess. Poor land use and environmental management. Inefficient development. Conflicts. And because of that, greater exposure to lawsuits. And I think everybody wants to avoid that, unless you are a lawyer, in which you might not want to avoid it, right? Okay. Just the basics, the Wisconsin Comprehensive Planning Law, back in 2010, changes to zoning, land, and official mapping ordinances must be consistent with an adopted comprehensive plan. They have to have at least these 9 elements. We'll talk about that in a little bit. And you have to have written procedures for public participation. Then there's rules about how you distribute these plans for review and how it's to be adopted by ordinance. And then in the law it also says this. It needs to be updated at least once every 10 years. How many people have updated their comprehensive plan since they've adopted it? Okay, we have a couple. Great. 3. So you guys will be the experts. You know more about this than I do. Again, it's a guide for decision making. Zoning, subdivision, and other land use approvals. That's how you use it. Okay? And hopefully, those of you who have comp plan, you are using it for these decisions. It's about looking at expansions of your major infrastructure and being able to plan ahead for those things, and about the location of new infrastructure, and decisions about annexation and additional territory, and about any sort of major public investments that you might be making. Now this is a really old map. The last time the DOA started publishing this map was 2010, so this is what we were looking at 2010. Everything in the pink is things that were adopted or in process of being adopted, and everything in the lighter green and yellow color, people just weren't doing anything, or we didn't know what they were doing. And then this is countywide. So it gives you a sense that, for the most part, the state of Wisconsin has supported this statute with their actions, if you look at how we've been planning across the state. And then just, how many people can find a comprehensive plan? Can you find it? If you had to look for it, you know where to find it? Okay. Well, here's Polk County. You can go there, and they have a list of different plans as well. You can find it from there. There's the 9 elements. Those of us that worked on comprehensive plans can probably name these off by heart. You have your issues and opportunities, your housing, your transportation, utilities and community services, agriculture, natural and cultural resources, which I always thought was hilarious. You try to put all that in one chapter. Economic development, intergovernmental cooperation, land use, and last but not least, implementation. So one of the things that people need to really be aware of is the legal implications that are part of the statute, and there are some very specific things out there that you need to pay attention to. It's making sure you have a written participation plan. It really details out how you're going to get the community members involved in your process. So it's methods for fostering public participation, for distributing the plan, and opportunity for written comments. And then you need to publish a Class 1 notice at least 30 days prior to public hearing. That's going to include date, time, and place of hearing, a summary, a contact person, and you need to be aware of the fact that some of these people that need to be aware of your planning efforts may not live in the area, and especially the non-metallic mining folks, they have to be contacted directly. So we need to make sure that we keep that in mind. When it comes to local government approval, it's kind of a 2-step process. You have your planning commission, they adopt a resolution, and then your governing board adopts it by ordinance. Pretty straightforward, but yet time consuming because you have hearings involved. One copy of the adoptive comprehensive plan amendment must be sent to the following. So you have your Wisconsin Department of Administration, DOA, your local RPC, and any county and adjacent units of government, and the public library. So why the heck would you want to update your comprehensive plan? Those of you who have updated your plan, why did you do it? Don't be shy. Well, you can take quite a bit of latitude as far as how you develop your public participation plan, but you just have to have a plan, okay? And I would agree with you when it comes to millennial generation, it's very hard to get them to show up for a meeting. It's also hard to get people to show up for a meeting if they own a business and you're having your meetings during the day. And so I think there are lots of different challenges out there of getting the public involved, but the law is written so they want you to think about this really seriously. How are you going to get the community involved and then commit to pen to paper, what is your plan? And what it does is it demonstrates that you've thought this out. Whether you're right or wrong, at least you've considered the things that you just mentioned. You know, there are some challenges to getting those different groups involved, but there's ideas out there as well, and there's resources as well. DOA's website's got a fantastic document about public participation, and then Extension has got some documents as well on public participation as well. You guys, you updated your plan. What were some of the issues that brought up your update? Exactly. Yep. So, you know, 5, 10 years ago, who the heck even heard of frac sand, right? Now, who hasn't heard of it? Right. So, definitely. So the list of things that they got up here is unforeseen and changing conditions, right? Changing community desires. Changes in political leadership. And the plan not performing as expected. And errors in the original plan. I have worked on a couple of plan updates, and in each of those updates, it was a combination of these things. It wasn't necessarily one or the other. It was really kind of a combination of things. And I think you'll probably find that to be true when your community starts moving forward and you take a hard look at your plan. There might be things that are just fine. You don't really have to make any changes to it, but there will be other things that will be glaring that you're going to be wondering, why the heck is that in there? So there's this time element. You need to set a timeline and process for reviewing your plan and an amendment process. If you don't do that, you won't do it. If you don't put on a calendar that you should review section 3 of your comprehensive plan on May 15th, you might not ever do it, right? I mean, it's a matter of discipline. It's about committing yourselves as a board and as a commission to really taking a hard look at what your document says and what it doesn't say, and just being methodical about it. So amendments considered upon request of landowner, developer, governing body, staff. So that's how do amendments come up? Lots of different ways. There are problems that come up with any legislation, any policy that a unit of government is working with. And those amendments, sometimes you're anticipating it because staff are telling you, you know, this thing is really a mess. Every time we try to implement this part of the policy, it just doesn't work very well, or it's not how we intended it for it to work. Those are things you would maybe anticipate. But you might have things like frac sand mining that you didn't anticipate coming out of the woodwork. What the statute says is there's minor changes should be considered annually, major review and rewrite at least once every 10 years as required by state statute. The problem is there's nothing that tells you what the difference between a minor and a major change is. That's really up to the jurisdiction to kind of figure that out. And that's probably best anyways, because every jurisdiction operates differently. And what might be a small little thing to one community might be a real big deal to another. So the last bullet there is you need to strike a balance between rigidity and flexibility when you're amending your plan. If you're going to be so strict that every time you have a slight change, you're going to do an entire comprehensive amendment process of the entire document, that's very rigid and it's going to be exhausting, and it's not going to be very workable. It's going to be very difficult for anybody to use that planning document to make decisions. However, if you just keep on waiting for a lawsuit to be filed, that's probably not the best way either. So you got to figure out a spot in between that makes sense. That's why I kind of recommend the folks to think about just scheduling time on your calendar where you're going to take a look at different parts of the comprehensive plan, or schedule a time with your staff and board and commission to sit down and say, you know, what's working and what isn't. Just get a handle on how how is your plan working? How is your process working? And try to figure out what isn't working and how can you make those improvements. Some communities have actually identified criteria for the amendment process. So what we have, City of La Crosse, they have a series of items that they put in their comprehensive plan that kind of identifies when to make an amendment, when not to, sort of thing. And that's fine. It might work for you. For others, it might not, because there's so many unforeseen circumstances. It's kind of hard to always write into legislation how to predict the future. If you look at the language of their pieces here, though, it's pretty open-ended in the sense that it's making sure the change, like number one, the change is consistent with the overall goals and objectives. Number two is the change does not create an adverse impact on public facilities and services. I mean, it's really about, it's okay to make the amendment as long as it doesn't screw up the rest of the plan, right? And then this gets into what we kind of talked about earlier, is when you're looking at your plan and what you're doing is you're auditing its performance. You're trying to figure out, is this working well or not? And so you'll want to review the goals, the objectives, the policies, see what's being implemented and what's not. Maybe you need to reprioritize things. Maybe you have to eliminate some stuff that you're just not using. It's just getting in the way. Here's something that I think everybody could probably benefit from. Take a look at the language that you're using in your comprehensive plan, because a lot of these that were done in response to the new legislation of the Smart Growth Comprehensive Planning Law were done in a very politically correct way because there was some controversy surrounding this as a requirement. And so I would say most comprehensive plans that I've come in contact with had very timid language in them, very loosey-goosey because they want to offend anybody. But then the adverse effect of that timid language is it doesn't give the planning body a lot of information as far as how to make a decision, because it's very wishy-washy. So this is a great time when you're looking at updating to look at the words that say something that consider this, or you may do this, or explore this. See if you can change the language a little bit, make it more definitive so that your staff and your commission and your board has a little clearer direction on where to fall on that line for a yes or a no answer. Because you're not giving them enough meat in a lot of cases with how to deal with a situation when it arises when you use so much may and explore kind of language. Try not to be so wishy-washy, I guess is what I'm saying, when you can. Consider updates to the future land use map and accompanying text to better inform the desired timing and pattern of future growth. So a lot of land use maps and proposed land use maps that were created were kind of like snapshots. Here's the world we have today. Here's the world that we want 10 years from now. That's fine, but a lot of things can happen in 10 years, and where development occurs first versus second versus third is just as important as where development will be in the future. And so what this is getting at is that time element, that you might want to consider different areas that you might cite as being a priority for your future development to happen first. So it's kind of phasing. This is where I'm kind of giving kudos to SewerPAC, the Regional Planning Commission, and they've got some fantastic resources out there for you that are for free. You can download. So if you need sample application forms, public hearing notices, planning commission resolutions, local government ordinances, adopting planning amendments, sample public participation procedures, so there you go. They've just done a lot of work in this, and they basically give this out to the public for free. Yeah. Southeast Wisconsin, oh, I'm sorry, it should be Regional Planning Commission, typo there, it should be RPC. They've done a lot of this, and they have a lot of great resources. I would highly recommend if you're stumbling and fumbling and you want an example at least, check them out. Sorry about the typo there. So this is about when do you going to update your plan, or how do you know? And we kind of talked a little bit about that already. Something to keep in mind is that when you're updating a comprehensive plan or any kind of plan, it's not necessarily any different than doing any normal planning activity. And so from the beginning, you need to plan for plan. You plan for a plan. And so you're going to look at what is the purpose of your planning effort. In this particular case, is to update your document. What geographic area are you going to cover? I mean, maybe you're going to change your geographic area. Maybe your community changed in size geographically, or maybe you're going to consider partnering with another community. I think that's probably one of the missed opportunities that doesn't happen enough in the state is communities partnering to develop their future land use maps, because I think there's a lot of conflict that can be avoided if they were to do so. Who's going to use the plan and how? How does that translate to the form of the plan and the content and how it looks? Who's going to prepare the document? Is this somebody in-house? Or are you going to have to hire out someone, put up an RFP, and then, of course, then how are you going to pay for it? There's no grant money out there right now to update your plan, but still a statutory requirement that you do. What process will you follow? It kind of depends on how bad a shape your plan is in, I guess, right? And what education and relationships do you need to build before getting started? So, well, I tell people when they're going to get involved in any sort of planning effort, there's a PR sort of aspect to that. There's not is it only about getting the public engaged in the process. It's about finding out where's the problem areas of doing so, and who do you need to get on board on this so that you can be successful, not just with developing a plan or updating a plan, but implementation, because that's what it's all about, is implementing it. So I'm going to show you a few different versions of how you might update your plan, okay? So the first one's like the Bandaid approach. Your plan, for the most part, is working fine, some minor modifications to it. You might take the existing plan and just add a supplement to it, okay? And that's going to highlight some new information in there. It's the easiest, least costly approach. You're really just going to make a little compendium that goes with your comprehensive plan that's going to just talk about the things that are updated, okay? The con to this, yeah. Yeah, we'll get to that. Yep, good question. The problems with doing this sort of approach is it might be difficult to ascertain which policies are current, which ones are not. So after you get the supplement created and somebody is trying to figure out, well, it says here on page 27 that this is your policy. Well, but you didn't look at the supplement. The supplement says on page 27, we've nixed that policy in lieu of this. So it can be confusing for the public if they're using it, or developers, or the Planning Commission themselves. So that would be one of the dangers of going that route. Number two, selectively revising portions of the plan. And I had an image of an X-Acto knife there because it's really being precise and going through your plan and trying to pick out exactly what you want to change. It's probably more cost-effective and less time-consuming than a total rewrite. It works best if your current plan is well written. That is really important. If you're working from a planning document that is not well written, using this process is just going to take a lot more time. It's going to be a big pain in the butt. It may be difficult to take a fresh look at issues or problems. And I would say that that's going to be your biggest challenge with any comprehensive plan update, is that nobody wants to start over. And I mean, all of us sat in those meetings for how many times developing your first comprehensive plan, and the last thing in the world people want to do is get back on that horse and go for that same ride. However, if you don't cover some of those same issues along the way, or cover the same chapters and some of those topics as they come up, you're not going to maybe catch some of the changes and nuances that need to occur in your update. Does that make sense? So it's definitely trying to figure out a balance of how much energy does your group have, and how serious are the changes that you have to consider. Option 3, this one's somewhat easy. Update the inventory or policy section only. So you're really just targeting the parts that have to do with data and numbers, and then looking at your policies and your implementation chapter and just kind of deciding, are these the right policies or not? This might be one of the simpler ways of dealing with this. It provides an opportunity to focus just on the policies. You can set some time and cost savings and compared to a complete overwrite. But again, this is assuming that that the issues in your community haven't changed much, okay? And in some communities, they might have changed quite a bit. If your leadership has changed, which probably has somewhat, They might not be aware of some of these issues that are in your comprehensive plan. And so all of a sudden, they might have a lot of questions as far as, well, why aren't we talking about this? So then it's really about bringing everybody on board. And of course, last but not least is the complete overhaul and rewrite of your comprehensive plan. And I have been a part of this process before, and I think that the biggest challenge there is keeping everybody's energy level up. Because if you've already gone through this once, it's really nice to adopt that plan and be done with it. And the idea of like starting over from scratch can be really daunting. But a lot of times it might be your best option. So it's a major undertaking. It avoids time-consuming and potentially tedious task of working with an existing plan, language, or format. So if you've got a plan that you don't even understand because the consultant had way more influence on the developing that document than you did, and you don't understand portions of it, and here you are trying to rewrite sections of it and parts of it, that might not be the best process. Maybe you do need to nuke this thing and start over. It works best if the existing plan requires a major overhaul, of course, right? Overall, this is kind of what the process, any sort of planning process looks like, but especially for comprehensive planning. You start with your pre-planning. Whoops, I thought that maybe that was a laser, and it's not. It makes it go black. Okay, there we go. Pre-planning, data analysis, issue identification, your goals and objectives, and your strategy formulation, review and approval process, and then the exciting part is implementation and monitoring. And then throughout that whole thing is public participation. So when we're looking at pre-planning, it's really about establishing your planning commission, making sure they understand what the task is ahead of them and what their roles are, what their responsibilities are. Assemble your planning team. Who's going to be at the table helping you develop this? What is your planning process you're going to use? We talked about those different examples just now. And then probably one of the more important things you do at the very beginning is prepare your public participation plan. Because that's the thing that is really probably it's going to help you the most, it's going to hurt you the most. If you do a good job with that plan, you're going to have people coming out of the woodwork to help you. And at the end of the day, they're going to help be an advocate for this when you're trying to implement the policies in this document. If you don't do a good job with that, and you don't have a lot of public participation on the front end of this, you're going to be making some guesses as a planning commission and as a board as far as what the issues are and what the priorities are of your community. And at the end of the day, when you're trying to implement these things and make decisions that sometimes are controversial, you may not have public support when you need it. So I can't advocate enough for developing a really rock-solid public participation plan that you feel comfortable with. Yep. Well, yeah, I saw that, yeah. Yeah, yeah. All right, thank you. And then again, you want to begin with public participation and education. Let the public know what you're up to. Don't surprise them that you're going to be all of a sudden updating something that could impact their housing values and their development patterns. When it gets to public participation, prepare a written public document, distribute copies of the plan for review, solicit and respond to written comments, hold a public hearing prior to the plan adoption. I mean, these are all stuff that you've already done before. Identify your audience and your stakeholders. This is really spending some time to think about who do you need to be a part of this process and whose input do you need to have. So this might be those who believe their interests are affected, those who have power or influence is enhanced or diminished by a land use decision primarily, those who have an axe to grind. I mean, we all know who those folks are. Make them part of the process. Instead of pushing them out of the process, include them, even if it's painful. Political or social movers and shakers, you know who those folks are as well. Representatives of decision-making bodies, so you might have other decision-making organizations or agencies that are within your jurisdiction that you might want to have their input so they understand what your process is and how they might be part of that. And the economic, social, political, and cultural interests. So every community has got a historical society probably, or some sort of organization that's a nonprofit that might have interests in housing or the natural environment, or agriculture. And as far as how you engage the public, there's a variety of ways and a variety of scales that you use dependent upon which areas of the public you're trying to reach. So there might just be the general sort of awareness campaign that you use for general public. There might be the education, like fact sheets of things that go out to folks that really explain why we're doing this. Then you might have direct input you're doing, either via survey or maybe workshops or so we've got focus groups. And then participation. This is where you get direct participation from the community through like a visioning process or an advisory committee. I always try to tell folks, when you're, not just when you're doing public participation in the sense of collecting their information, try to get those folks on part of your team that's creating the document itself. So you don't have to just stick with your staff or your town planning commission or whatever it is. You can bring in other folks that might have something to add to this. And what they'll do is they'll bring in their information, their expertise, and then they become an advocate of the process as well. So this might include developers, neighborhood groups, environmental groups, design professionals, business owners, and other community groups. Identify the project champions. Who's out there that's going to keep the energy level going on this? That's going to be important. So if you have somebody in mind in your community that may or may not be elected, but has got their heart in the right place and they're an advocate for your community and people pay attention to them, get them to be a part of the process so that they can be an advocate for what you're doing and they can keep the energy level moving forward. Okay? This is political as well as planning. So before you do any of this stuff, make sure you talk to the elected officials so they know what you're up to. So don't just surprise them. Don't have the staff just kind of put on the agenda that we're going to start updating the comprehensive plan. Make sure you've had lengthy discussions with your elected body about issues that we've had about the plan and things that we're thinking about doing. So why are we doing this? What are the current regulations? What are the proposed changes? And how will those changes impact our constituents? 9 elements, you already know what those are. You might consider the time relationship, focus on topics that are most important to you. Realize that maybe there's the 9 elements. You can actually add elements as well. And so one community had energy, food systems, public health, and sustainability as additional chapters. First piece is about, a lot of this stuff we can probably go fast forward. If you've done a comp plan, it's really about gathering data, your ag and natural and cultural resource data, mapping your existing and potential development patterns. These are different communities, different ways of doing things, okay? Here's one from out east that I thought was interesting. They look at conserve, enhance, and transform. That's how they look at land use decisions in the future. So identify the areas you want to conserve, the areas you want to enhance, and the areas that definitely need to be changed. Then you need to identify what your issues are in your community and try to create a community vision. So try to figure out where you want to be in the future and how you're going to get there. Some examples that we have, you guys probably all did surveys, right? Okay, so here's an example out of Columbia County. 90% felt it was important to permanently retain productive agricultural lands in the county. Well, that's pretty significant. You see something like that, you got to pay attention when you're on that planning commission and you're updating your comp plan to make sure that that's still in there. And I've seen communities when they update their plan to actually do a survey again, just because they want to see how relevant their issues are. SWOT analysis, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. Any questions about what those things are? Remembering that strengths and weaknesses, those are the internal sort of attributes of your community, and the opportunities and threats, or challenges is a politically correct way of saying it, are the external things that are affecting your community. We want to develop goals and objectives, identify possible policies and programs and actions that you'll find later on in your implementation chapter. Include measurable indicators. This doesn't happen quite enough. If there's advice I can give to anybody on their implementation chapter is try to put measurable indicators in there. Why? Anybody know? Right, you don't know where you're at. You have no idea if your plan is good or how well you are doing as a board or as a commission as far as implementing your own plan if you don't put anything in there to give you a sense of where you're at. And I'll show you some examples here. So, well, this one is an example of that, but Town of Dunn, this is, they wanted to preserve agricultural areas, so they had a goal, and then their objective was to protect farm operations for incompatible adjacent land uses and activities. Then they were incredibly specific with their action. And so their strategy talks about minimizing the amount of farmland rezoned to non-agricultural use. And then they show that the areas to be considered for rezoning are the following. So they get really detailed, okay? So again, I guess I'm stressing that try to add detail to these things so that your planning commission and your decision-making body really has a handle on whether to weigh on the yes side or the no side, okay? Other ways of illustrating how we might have strategies be implemented are Marshfield's got the different way of looking at land use being transformed over time. So they'll have their status quo version versus traditional neighborhoods versus mixed-use neighborhoods. And just showing different options on how you might make decisions. I think I'm going to fast forward through some of these here because you guys are pros and you've already done a lot of this. Just remember that when you're updating your plan, you follow the same process and procedures as you do with adopting your plan from the first time. So it's no change, okay? It's a planning activity as far as the state is concerned. 2009 Act 372 clarified that the comprehensive plan is not a regulation, okay? It's a guide, it's an umbrella guide for your regulatory instruments within that. What it should do is it should try to get all of your regulatory tools and instruments all in the same direction. That's what a comprehensive plan should be doing for you. So this is about plan implementation, monitoring, and updates. Again, we talked about this earlier. You need to have some implementation tools. You need to review annually for performance. If you don't have performance indicators, it's going to be really difficult to do that. Update the plan at least once every 10 years. Develop criteria for considering amendments and determining consistency. Consider incremental updates once a year. And use same process to adopt the plan. These are different ways of implementation. These are non-regulatory things. It's mostly about education. And then there might be individual investments by the county as far as acquisition of land or purchase of development rights, capital improvement plans. These are different ways of implementing policies within your document, and density bonuses. Regulatory tools, these are the ones that you're probably more familiar with. Zoning, official mapping, subdivision regulation, sign ordinances, those types of things. And again, the purpose of your comprehensive plan is to get all these things kind of traveling in the same direction so there isn't any conflicting language. Your action plan in your last chapter for plan implementation, it's really about setting up timelines and resources and who's responsible for what and how you're going to measure success. Here's an example of one that was pulled out of a plan in which they really detail out, whoops, did it again, sorry guys. They really detail out the individual actions, who's responsible for those activities, what the cost may or may not be, the timing, funding options. This last one is probably most important, is how do those individual actions relate to the principles in their vision. So here's the principles of their vision and the little dots that indicate which principles it's touching on and addressing. And then here's one example of performance measures. So some community had a bicycle master plan as part of their implementation strategy, and in here are the performance measures. So they're looking at the percentage of bicycle network completed. Baseline data was that 34% of the network currently exists as recommended, and then they put some targets in here. 60% by 2015, 70% by 2020, 100% by 2030. Who's going to collect that data? The Parks Department will. So it doesn't have to be super complicated, but it should be written down somewhere so that when you are looking at the performance of your plan, you can go to something like this and see, well, where are we at? Does that make sense? Okay. Again, annual self-audit is probably a good idea to have. Try to include as many folks around the table that are using that document so that they feel like they're part of the process and you get their input. Here's another way. So if you, in addition to having performance measures, another thing you might want to do if you're part of the staff is look at summarizing the number and types of rezones, conditional uses, variances, and appeals. That might give you an indication of whether or not some of your policies are relevant or effective, or maybe they're contrary to how your community actually does feel about decisions that are being made. If you're seeing a lot of variances, chances are you have something in your plan that might need to be changed. Does that make sense? Okay. Format, you're going to try to make sure that this thing gets drafted by a team of individuals that represent kind of the broader community as well as your decision makers. So try to have your staff involved. Maybe you want a consultant if you have the funds for it. The governing body, somebody from the governing body should be part of drafting this update. The planning commission, maybe you might have an advisory committee of citizens and some special interest groups, and of course legal counsel. It's always good to have legal counsel involved. You do not want to have a document that looks like the one on the right when you're all done, okay? So lengthy plans are scary, short plans are incomplete, brevity is good, completeness is good, leaving things out is very bad, okay? Make sure that people can use your document. Organize it in a way that makes sense for your users, okay? I mean, it's nice if it makes sense to the state of Wisconsin, but make sure that the people who are actually using this, it makes sense to them first. The writing style, try to avoid legalese. That doesn't help anybody if you guys are standing in the room trying to figure out what the heck that sentence means. Cross-referencing, try to only say things once. Try not to say that same sentence over and over again in different parts of your book, because all of a sudden you're going to get a typo, or it's going to be written slightly different in one area, and then you're going to have confusion and you're going to have a lawsuit because you guys are fighting over what is the intent or meaning of that policy. So try to just say those things once and then use cross-referencing throughout your chapters to go back to that original policy statement. Does that make sense? Okay. Use a lot of tables and graphics because people like pictures. And a picture is 1,000 words, and you can make that document get a lot shorter. Some communities are actually doing posters like this and brochures that help explain the comprehensive plan so that in a nutshell they can give people a snapshot about what they're up to. Signs of a good plan: it's legally sound, it reflects community desires, it's a result of public involvement, users understand it, local officials can apply it, and a plan is really only useful when implemented, but a plan will only be implemented if it's useful. Does that make sense? I had to read it 3 times before it made sense to me. I'm probably almost out of time here. So the last piece here that we're not going to have time for, it has to do with consistency. And there's lawyers in the room that can probably talk much more clear about that than I can. But basically, the law says that you need to make sure that your decisions are consistent with what your comprehensive plan says. It doesn't have to be literal verbatim, but it does have to be consistent. So it means it can't conflict with your comprehensive plan. Does that make sense? Okay. There's lots of gobbledygook in here about that. It's not literal. Probably one of the things that I should point out is absence of a policy does not create an inconsistency. So just because you didn't have a policy about frac sand mining doesn't mean you weren't thinking about the environment. Okay. And then these are just different ways in which communities are trying to understand what consistency is by using one map for proposed land use versus one map for zoning, and you have to make those decisions as a body to figure out what makes sense for you. And actually the one I'd like to point out here that I like, not because I worked on it, because I didn't, was this one here in Sparta where they use these bubbles to indicate future land uses instead of being parcel specific. This helps you avoid things like spot zoning coming up in conversation because it's almost impossible to say that you were targeting an individual property because you're using these globs. And the rest of this, I think we're just going to have to rely on the packet. So, Yeah. So University of Wisconsin Extension, we are not consultants. So we cannot tell you what to do and what not to do. We can help you by providing you with educational resources. Does that make sense? So we can help find stuff for you and give it to you. We can help you decipher some of the gobbledygook that is part of this, but we can't tell you what to do with it. Does that make sense? All right. No problem.